10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Okay, now where did I... No way! You're both alright! A little rattled, but we can buff it out. Certainly in better shape than some others. Oh, viewers, allow me to introduce myself. I am Player Carter, and these are my theories. All two of them that are still relevant, at least. First, we got Deltarune is real. I bet you've heard of that one before. And last, but certainly not overshadowedly least, Deltarune, the Change Prophecy. Miraculously, likely through their abstract nature, these two theories have somewhat weathered the thermonuclear storm that was the release of Deltarune Chapters 3 and 4. That's right, I built these babies to last. You see, for the most part, the information we've received from these new chapters have perhaps not confirmed, but at least vaguely supported these theories. In fact, with Chapter 4 greatly reinforcing themes of fate, these theories are honestly in better shape than they were before. The reason I mention them is because the theory I will be presenting in this video follows many key concepts that I established in these two former ones. It will be covering topics such as the barrier between reality and unreality, determination, predetermination, and ultimately, the condition of fiction itself. I'm going to be going rather quickly, as there's a lot to talk about, more than what can be reasonably covered in just one video. But don't worry if you haven't seen these theories. They're going to be acting simply as starting points for the arguments made in this video, though their dedicated videos are still available if you need a bit more detail. To start, in the beginning of Chapter 3, Susie questions Rousey on why he cannot go to the light world. Rousey answers this by pulling out his now notorious fatalist eye bags and stating that darkness cannot go to the light worlds because the dark world is not real, and is rather the illusory product of negative light that brings inanimate objects to life. Because of this, Rousey believes that darkners simply do not matter beyond their ability to serve lightners, and should ultimately be forgotten if this purpose is lost. Susie understandably has a hard time accepting this because of how much she has developed from her adventures in the dark world. She says that darkners are genuine people with feelings, claiming how it makes no sense for them to be nothing more than the inanimate objects that are their light world counterparts. This is an important detail because pre-chapters 3 and 4, there was never an actual clear answer whether the dark world was considered real or not. Of course, it was certainly implied not to be, to some extent, but it is still nonetheless important that Deltarune has now made this distinction, as it shows that it is indeed a theme that it intends to explore. This leads to this concept of dark worlds not being real recurring throughout chapters 3 and 4, with Rousey prompting the player on whether he, and by extension darkners, actually have and deserve their own will and identity, beyond just serving lightners. What I find most interesting about this question is how rhetorical it actually is when you put it into perspective. To us the player, the light world is no more real than the dark world. Both are simply parts of the piece of fiction that is Deltarune. So the question of whether one is truly more real than the other is somewhat meaningless. I point this out because I believe this deconstruction of the barrier between what is real and what is not is exactly how Deltarune is going to resolve this question in later chapters. You see, Rousey is at the center of this distinction that the dark world is not real. Even at the end of chapter 4, he still thinks that the feelings he has are less important than Chris and Susie's for the simple reason that darkners are not real. What's interesting about this is that Rousey is subservient to more than just lightners, as he also constantly appeals to the action of the soul, which is us the player. Ralsei has a deep awareness of us and almost blindly respects our actions, for better and for worse. And as I just mentioned, to us the player, this distinction between the dark world being not real to the light world is meaningless from our perspective in reality. So, I believe for Ralsei to truly realize that he and all other Darkners actually matter, he has to realize that the soul that is controlling Chris comes from a world that is even more real than the light world. I think that after this realization in some future chapter, he'll come to realize that he, and the dark world in general, do truly matter, that the notion of his unreality is only a matter of perspective. This is nice and dandy and all, but this is only the beginning of Deltarune's deconstruction of reality. As, if this is the case, then what truly differentiates the light world from the dark world, and our world from Deltarune? Well, that would be none other than determination. Which brings us to the next notable event, the battle with the Roaring Knight. This battle is very interesting. It's so difficult, it's as if the very outcome is determined. It's as if your loss is a matter of fate itself. But, if you do not accept this fate, if you deliberately choose to reload your save, go back, and try again, a certain someone becomes very, very interested. If you retry the battle with the knight, something changes. Now, when you lose, the same voice you see in the Goner Maker, game over screens, and the same voice that announces every time a new chapter releases, pauses the game and comments on how determined you are to be going back and trying again. This voice then helps you with your efforts by hastening them, allowing you to instantly try again after every time you fail. This voice then has more to say the closer you get to defeating the knight, stating how it is our power shining brightly that is allowing us to keep trying. Eventually, if you do keep trying, you will get a different ending to the battle. You won't exactly win, but you will certainly question the notion that you cannot. Now, all this talk about an ominous voice enabling us, the player, to use our soul power to defy fate is not something that is necessarily new. You see, these other places we see this ominous voice also subtly hint at its intention to use us to defy a predetermined fate. When the first chapter of Deltarune was announced, this voice very clearly stated that it looked forward to building a new future with us. Deltarune begins with this voice connecting us to the game in some diegetic manner, and if you choose to give up during a normal game over, this voice will state that the world was covered in darkness as a result of your decision. All this builds a pretty clear picture on this voice's general intentions, which, by the way, this voice is in some way W.D. Gaster, which is the name I'm going to be using from now on for the sake of brevity. Anyways, what this tells us about Gaster is that he is actively seeking out some anomalous being that can change the predetermined future of Deltarune, someone that can prevent the world from being covered in darkness, which is called the Roaring. And what Gaster found is us, and that is diegetically how we find ourselves playing Deltarune. All of this can be pretty safely deduced from the information we currently have. But the question still stands of why we, the player, hold some special power to change this fate. Well, it's because of the aforementioned force that truly separates reality from unreality. That being determination. You see, the reason the dark world is considered not real to the light world is because it is determined by the light world. In order to create a dark fountain, a lightner must use determination. In other words, they must determine the dark world. We see this determination in dark worlds through a dark fountain's enforcement of a singular determined identity that everything in a dark world must abide by. This is what is called the will of the fountain, the reason darkners turn to stone if they do not belong in a dark world. What's important about this singular determined state is that it only applies to darkners, as lightners are the ones who determined it, and are therefore unaffected by the fountain's determination. When we apply this concept of determination separating what is real and what is not to the piece of fiction that is Deltarune, we see that the entire game and how we interact with it follows this exact same dynamic, When a dark fountain is created, the balance between light and dark shifts towards darkness, eventually causing the roaring, which is a fate that Deltarune is determined to follow, only unless we use our power, which is at least partially the power to seal dark fountains, which is an act only we, the soul, can do. It's our greater freedom over Deltarune's determination. This is why Gaster connected us to Deltarune. We are from a greater reality, and are thus not determined by Deltarune's lesser reality, allowing us to change Deltarune's fate, to determine Deltarune's fate ourselves. To expand on this idea, the power that we, the player, hold is more generally described as the light in our soul, which we see used very explicitly in Chapter 4. This light in our soul symbolizes determination as well, as this light is the antithesis of darkness, which has now been very clearly tied to damaging distinctions and hiding the truth. Our ability to counteract this darkness is an act of determination, as our light upholds the truth and shows things how they actually are. In terms of observation, this is an act of determination. Now, this is nice and all that Gaster is using us to save Deltarune's world through our soul power over its unreality. But the thing is, saving the world from darkness was never the difficult part. In fact, it's so brain-dead simple that we got a whole prophecy explaining how to do it. All of the glass panes in Chapter 4 accurately foresee all the supposed events of Deltarune. That is the prophecy of Deltarune. You know, when Gaster says, "It's waiting. How much longer now? My Deltarune." I think it's pretty clear that Gaster is referencing the actual prophecy here, since he says this at the end of Chapter 4, which is when Ralsei talks about how distressing it is that the prophecy hasn't changed yet. Gaster wouldn't be so sure that his depiction of the prophecy is approaching if the actual prophecy hasn't been changed. So the prophecy we see in Chapter 4 is Gaster's prophecy. He foresees how our actions will fulfill his intentions of preventing the roaring, at any cost, to the point that he believes it is simply waiting to happen, that it is fate, written. Gaster's ability to foresee the future aligns with the fact that he appears to actually have the ability to manipulate time. As we know from trying to access save files before Chapter 1's completion, Gaster is the one actually managing our saves, which is our means to go back and forth to a fixed point in time. This is why he was able to hasten our efforts to reload just before the fight with the knight. Gaster's ability to manage our saves, combined with our ability to start the game at any chapter, shows us that he can see the future of Deltarune, which is what allowed him to create the prophecy. Now, you may wonder why our ability to jump forward into the future is an actual canon ability Gaster holds. Wouldn't this mean that once the game is complete, we can simply jump to Chapter 7 and canonically finish the game, despite only actually playing through a seventh of it? Susie even somewhat mentions this in Chapter 4, where she mentions how the prophecy makes everything easier. Well, that's not exactly true. Sure, that may be the supposed end to Deltarune, but as Toby Fox has said, there's something more important than reaching the end. This is because the foreseen end of the prophecy, the one ending of Deltarune, is not actually a good ending. Unfortunately, as we've seen by the end of Chapter 4, this prophecy has a catch. Sure, the light and dark worlds will be saved from the roaring, but at a cost. As I've mentioned already, saving the world from darkness was not going to be the difficult part. Whatever this cost is, seems to be the actual problem we are going to be faced with in later chapters. Though what exactly this cost is still unknown, as it is so tragic that Ralsei, who Gaster implanted the prophecy into in completion, refuses to even acknowledge it, being quite depressingly tormented by knowledge, and Susie displays the glass displaying it in rage. But despite this cop-out, I believe we've been provided with enough context to form a conclusion on what it may be. Let's start by running through all the glass panes surrounding this tragedy. The last prophecy, the story's end. And then, when all hope is lost for the tale, the final tragedy unveils. To save the worlds, there is only one way.
Only then will the worlds be saved.
It may seem like we're completely dead for answers here, but I actually have a lot to say about this. Firstly, if you haven't noticed, the prophecy constantly rhymes. To give a few examples,
A world basked in purest light, beneath it grew eternal night. If fountains freed the roaring cries, and titans shape from darkened eyes. Light and dark both burning dire, countdown to the earth's expire.
and of course, in the pains leading up to the tragedy,
And then, when all hope is lost for the tale, the final tragedy unveils.
the reason I mention this is because the next pain after this, that comes just before the tragedy, is without a shadow of a doubt the beginning of a rhyme.
To save the worlds, there is only one way.
So let me fill in the gaps here, with the understanding that it must end with something that rhymes with way.
To save the worlds, there is only one way. The blank must be cast away. Only then will the worlds be saved.
I don't know about you, but that rings pretty perfectly in my ears, and the act of casting away will make a lot more sense with the rest of my points. It's important to understand what Susie says after she reads the tragedy. She goes on about how she and Chris would never let it happen, but most importantly, she says that, obviously, Ralsei wouldn't let it happen. This, paired with Ralsei's self-sacrificial mindset, believing it's okay for Darkners to be forgotten if they no longer have purpose, leads me to believe that this tragedy is not so much about Susie, but about Ralsei, some great sacrifice that concerns the Dark World. The reason I think this is because of what Susie says when you go to seal the fountain right after this. She talks about how she dreams that no matter what, she will always be friends with Chris and Ralsei, and that the adventures they have together will never end either. Obviously, whatever she saw in the prophecy made her question this. This is supported by the fact that Ralsei may also mention the exact same concept of a never-ending adventure in this scene as a means to cope with the tragedy, which is why I believe that this tragedy is the end of these adventures, or more accurately, the end of what they have all accumulated into. The end of the place Susie uncharacteristically is against visiting after she knows of its fate. That being, the end to our castle town. Obviously, Ralsei wouldn't allow this, right? Right? But that's not everything. If you don't remember, we're basically told what the final tragedy is. Ralsei tells us the whole prophecy in the legend. Sure, it may be summarized, but it still very clearly has the prophecy's ending, and therefore the tragedy, albeit masked under a layer of ambiguity. Only they can seal the fountains, and banish the angels' heaven. Only then will balance be restored, and the world saved from destruction. Whatever this final tragedy is, it is somewhere in here. And of course, what is more tragic than the banishment of heaven itself? The seeming condition required to end the roaring. And what's another term for banishing? Oh yeah, casting away. But then, what exactly is the angel's heaven? When you really think about it, it's quite obviously Castletown. The castle itself is covered in a bunch of very unambiguous angelic wings. And if you're a believer that the player is the angel, this is our heaven. It's named after us, and is the place we take everyone we recruit, to build an ever-growing, bustling salvation for all Darkners, where everyone is happy and just having a good time. In other words, it's heaven. Our heaven. The angels' heaven. With all this laid out, I'd like to give my final conclusion on what I believe the final glass pane actually said.
And then, when all hope is lost for the tale, the final tragedy unveils. To save the worlds, there is only one way. The grand fountain must be cast away. Only then will the worlds be saved.
This is what I believe to be the tragedy of Deltarune, the sealing of the Grand Fountain. It could also instead say the Angel's Heaven or Castletown must be cast away, as they all essentially mean the same thing, but the Grand Fountain seems to fit the best, especially since sealing the Grand Fountain would go along with the ultimate milestones of the story being sealing Dark Fountains. Now, I'm not going to sit here and claim that I'm the first to come to this conclusion. In fact, I believe this concept has loosely existed since Chapter 1, but I think with the new evidence we have received, and the arguments I have provided, it has never been more clear that this is the direction of Deltarune's story. In order to put an end to the roaring, restore balance, and save the world from destruction, the Grand Fountain must be sealed, which makes sense given that it is the source of pure darkness. But tangent aside, I believe that I have come to a rather solid conclusion that we must seal the Grand Fountain, banishing Castletown in the process, in order to stop Deltarune's world from being covered in darkness. To be honest, there's a part of me that kind of regrets even trying to answer this, because of the fear that I may have just spoiled such a tremendously tragic thing that I obviously don't want to actually happen, but is also at the same time something that most possibly is going to happen. But don't worry yet. I kind of had to come up with an understanding of the problem we've been presented with to be able to form an actual solution to it. Obviously, the story isn't going to just end there, at least not meta-narratively. But to get to that solution, we must first fully understand the condition of fiction. Like we've already established, the dynamic between the light and dark worlds is one of reality and unreality, paralleling the dynamics of how we, the player, interact with the piece of fiction that is Deltarune. This dynamic is essentially one determines the other. Lightners determine the dark world, just as we determine Deltarune. Darkners are bound by the determinative will of their fountains, and Lightners are not. The characters of Deltarune are bound by the determinative fate of the prophecy, and we, the player, are not. This is already stuff we've been over. To extend this idea, anyone has the ability to essentially trade their reality for fiction. Lightners can create darkness, giving form to the dark world by trading the form of the light world, making it, quote, less distinct, just as we, the player, can create light, upholding the form of Deltarune by in some manner trading the form of our world as we are immersed in another. What this concept of immersion shows us is that this model of fiction is not complete. You see, the primary function of a dark fountain is not enforcing its will onto Darkner's identities. It is rather to give form, which is essentially to give life, to a dark world. The enforcement of will, rather, is merely a byproduct of this primary function of giving form. This exact same dynamic applies to our interaction with Deltarune. This is because the prophecy requires us, the player, to be present. So, therefore, the prophecy's ability to foresee the future is directly tied to our connection to Deltarune's world. To illustrate this idea, if you're so worried about Deltarune's fate already being decided, how about this? Just give up. And instead of banishing Castletown, the world can just be covered in darkness. Congratulations, you just broke the prophecy. It's as simple as that. But in all seriousness, the reason I mention this is to show that we, the player, are indeed at the center of carrying out the prophecy. After all, only we have the power of light that can uphold the form of the light world. Only we can seal the fountains. Only we can seal the Grand Fountain. This is why our connection to its world is diegetic. Just as the will of the fountain is merely a byproduct of a dark world having form to Lightners, the fate of the prophecy only actually exists as a byproduct of our connection, of Deltarune having form to us, the player. Deltarune's fate only exists if we, the player, are there to determine it. And because of that, and I know this is going to sound a little unintuitive, if we were never connected to Deltarune, the roaring would never even be a threat of happening in the first place. Let me explain, and I warn you that this is going to get very meta. If you never play Deltarune, if you are never connected to its world, will it ever reach an ending? No, it will not. There would be no saying whether the world was saved, covered in darkness, or anything in between. It would never have a determined ending. Even if you stopped now, everything that will happen after you leave would immediately become undetermined, unprophesizable. Deltarune's fate would no longer exist. Such is the byproduct of our connection. You see, the prophecy foresees all of Deltarune, not just the heroes saving the world. It foresees the roaring itself, just as much as it foresees the tragedy required to end it. So, if we, the player, are ultimately the ones who determine this fate, the ones who the prophecy derives its predetermination from, then in our absence, in the severance of our connection, there would no longer be any tragic prophecy, nothing to say what will happen in the future. So perhaps, in light of these newfound consequences of our determination, the best move is simply not to play. To withdraw our determinative power from Deltarune's world, to withdraw ourselves from Deltarune's world. Now, of course, this isn't much better than banishing Castletown. In fact, both of these solutions are kind of parallels of each other, which shows us an ultimate reality. What if, at the end of Deltarune, we'll have to choose? Do we let go, severing our connection to Deltarune's world? Or do we make them let go, casting away their fantastical adventures? No matter what you choose, it must end with letting go of a fantasy. I guess that's why Ralsei, the one who is the first to be faced with this ultimate reality, is so ready to be forgotten. All this talk about letting go of fiction makes you wonder why the prophecy has to be this way, why Ralsei is so adamant that that which is not real must be cast away the instant it no longer has purpose to you. Well, where do you think he got such a philosophy? As we can understand from how Gaster wrote the prophecy, he believes that, either way, fiction that has fulfilled its purpose must be given up and forgotten. This utilitarian view of fiction has seeped into everything that he has influence over. His surgical speech about these entire individualized worlds that we call save files, his attempt at disillusioning the secret bosses, his writing of the prophecy, and of course, Ralsei's fatalist eye bags. All these things he has influenced all point toward the objectivity of fiction, as just words on a page, images on a screen, or lines of code in a computer, to view these worlds as if they were just a game. This view is ultimately the source of this situation with Castletown. At the end of the story, at the end of the prophecy, you must let go of the fantasy you have grown so attached to. Gaster wrote this. This is his worldview. And can you really blame him for thinking this? Sure, it is tragic, but don't all stories have an end? Isn't it necessary to move on from fiction once it is complete? Isn't the dream of a never-ending adventure just that? A dream? Is it foolish to believe such an outcome is even possible? Well, as Susie sees it, no. Her role in this conundrum of fiction, as we've seen through her actions in chapters 3 and 4, is one of ultimately hope. Hope that there is a better outcome to fiction than just being discarded. This hope comes from how much she has grown attached to the dark world, no matter how unreal it may be. She even hit us with the line, "You're real to me." Susie is the antithesis of Gaster's utilitarian view of fiction. Her entire development is a symbol of the actual real value that fiction has in our lives. Only from her fantastical adventures in the dark world did she ever start making real friends and become genuinely a better person. She's not holding on to the dark world out of escapism. She's holding on to the dark world because it is real. Because fiction is real. Because Deltarune is real. Real through the real influence that it has on our lives. Of course, fiction is more than just a husk of information to be discarded once it is fulfilled. Of course, I doubt that this is the ultimate solution to Deltarune's problem with fate. Sure, we'd no longer be there to doom its world, but we'd also not be there to save it either. It would simply be left undetermined. This is likely what is going to be considered the neutral ending of Deltarune, and is probably exactly what will happen if you choose to start the game after Chapter 1. The whole reason you can do that is probably to show what would happen if the player never took any action to defy the prophecy. You're not doing everything in your power to save Deltarune's world, nor are you doing everything in your power to destroy it. You are merely not using your power at all. Your power of determination. So, what will happen if we do try and use our determination against Deltarune's prophecy? Like I've already established, we are capable of taking actions that will defy it, such as choosing to simply give up on a game over. So what will happen if we try to deviate from this central neutral route to achieve a different outcome? Whatever these alternate routes may be, they'll likely surround preventing the banishment of Castletown, as that is the ultimate outcome of the prophecy, and what I believe to be at the center of Deltarune's subversive message, as I will get into. To start, we already know that there is a different route beyond either the prophecy or the roaring, that being the weird route, which Ralse implies as being something else, other than the prophecy, which is even worse. Which makes sense since the weird route leaves Castletown almost entirely empty. So even if you could manage to save Castletown in spite of the prophecy, there really wouldn't be anything to save. Not to mention all the horrible things that would be required to save it in the first place. So I guess the weird route isn't much of a better deviation than the roaring. But the existence of the weird route does imply another way to defy the prophecy, since it is generally defined by the player's choices taken to the extreme. That being, attacking everything you can, which, as the game describes, breaks bonds and makes you stronger. You see, the thing about extremes is that they always have a polar opposite. In this case, that would be sparing everything you can, which is considered recruiting. Recruiting everyone being an alternate route is supported by the fact that there are precautions to ensure you know if you have recruited everyone, which has been reinforced in chapters 3 and 4. This would only be necessary if there was a route that involved recruiting everyone. This is important because what recruiting does is build up Castletown into a larger and more vibrant place. As the recruitment description says, wonder what happens if you get them all. Which makes sense. If the alternate routes of Deltarune surround preventing the banishment of Castletown, of course one of these routes would involve building up Castletown to its largest and most, quote, love-filled state, while the other involves leaving Castletown in its smallest and most hate-filled state. It's also important to keep in mind what would actually enable these alternate routes to defy the prophecy. The sealing of the Grand Fountain appears to be a failsafe that will only need to be enacted if the heroes of legend fail in some sense. It only happens after the roaring has already started, and quote, all hope is lost for the tale. The reason I mention this is because both the weird and supposed pacifist routes may leave the player in a position where they can simply prevent the roaring themselves without needing to resort to the prophecy's tragic solution. Like already mentioned, the weird route is generally defined by getting stronger. This strength can grow so much that, as we see in Chapter 2, it is capable of completely removing parts of the game that are normally mandatory. So who's to say that once you get to this point in the prophecy in the weird route, you'll have become so strong that you can simply defeat the knight and or roaring yourself, no longer needing to resort to sealing the Grand Fountain. This also may as well be the case in the supposed pacifist route. After all, there is most certainly a reason we are able to recruit Darkners and study their elemental stats. Perhaps in the pacifist route, we will be able to raise an army that will allow us to defeat the knight and or roaring as well. This is why I think it's pretty clearly stated that darkness-related enemies, like the knight and titans, are justified to use violence against, with Ralse stating that titans do not have consciousness, and the knight probably falling somewhere along those lines as well. Don't get me wrong, I do think this is Des, just not all of her. There's a reason Toby states that some battles must be done violently. When it seems like you need a fight, please do so with conviction. To support this idea, Darkners teaming up to help us because of our kindness is already something we've seen at the end of every single chapter if you manage to recruit every Darkner. So I am 100% convinced that we're going to be able to actually use our recruits eventually. Though, don't ask me how that's going to work when they've all turned to stone if the roaring happens. But the bottom line here is that through our actions, through our sole determination acting strongly upon Deltarune's world to achieve a certain extreme, love or hate, we will most certainly be able to defy the prophecy and save Castletown from banishment, for better or for worse. Which leads me to what I believe to be Deltarune's ultimate subversive message. Castletown and its difficult situation is a symbol of the challenge to achieve a never-ending story. In most attempts, it will not work out. Sooner or later, the story must meet its ending, as the great barrier of finality, of fate, is ever looming. However, given enough love and overpowering determination, this barrier of fate will begin to crumble at your will. Only then will you be able to realize the dream of a never-ending story. a place to revisit all of your past adventures, despite them being gone forever. I can talk much about the exact implications of such a thing, but I'd rather leave that for Toby to explain. Again, this is nice and all that we can know pretty clearly that there is a good ending through being a true pacifist, but I know for a fact that it isn't going to be that simple, nor exactly what you'd expect. Because what you'd expect probably isn't actually possible. Achieving that dream Susie has comes with great nuance, as I covered in my last video. There's a reason the weird route has already been identified as distinctly alternate, while the supposed true pacifist route has not. Ralsei says at the end of chapter 4 that he thought if we were just kind enough, the prophecy would change. Well, as we can see, it hasn't. While I think this notion that no matter how kind we are, the prophecy won't change is primarily so that we require hope that there is a good ending, which pairs well with Deltarune's episodic releases, I think it's also there to tell us that in order to have our cake and eat it too, we're going to need to be more than just a pacifist. Which aligns with the fact that the weird route isn't just about choosing violence. It's also about choosing to control vulnerable people, and using them to push the game beyond its limits. I'd love to know what more exactly is required for the good ending, but the problem is that this model of fiction can't really tell us how to achieve such a thing, where we can determine that Deltarune's world is saved, and on good terms. The answer to that is probably held in collecting the shadow crystals, collecting the eggs, which seems to piss off Gaster, and fighting the night out of sheer persistence. All of these being some exercise in hoping and dreaming. But more likely, it's probably held in, I don't know, the actual completed version of the game? You can't expect me to answer all of Deltarune's questions with what we have now, at least not in a single video. So, luckily, while I have exhausted this theory, there are far more of these to come, perhaps in exchange for liking, subscribing, and maybe even commenting? I love to read comments. But anyways, that's enough existential crisis projection for one video. As I mentioned in the beginning, I have lots more to say about these new chapters. Here's some of them. If any interest you, be sure to let me know.